Rule of law. Has everybody seen, and I'm sure you've seen this in books before, you may have visited the Supreme Court up in Washington, D.C., and there you would have seen it. But there's a statue that's called the Lady of Liberty. She's depicted, she's always depicted blindfolded, and she has the scales in one hand and a sword in the other. Or, it's not Lady Liberty, it's Lady Justice, I'm sorry. Now the purpose of that blindfold is to mean that when you become before the bar of justice, it doesn't matter who you are. That the law is going to be meted out the same no matter who you are. And then the sword represents the power of the state, justices, or not justice, the scales represents, well, I don't know. What do the scales represent? Equality. Something. I'm sure there's good reason for it. But today we hear a lot about another concept. It's not the rule of law. It's about social justice. Now this is what the progressives believed in. Now social justice is the exact opposite of the rule of law. Social justice says, if you're a member of the majority, your rights are one thing. If you're an aggrieved minority, your rights are something else. If you're Amish, your rights are one thing. If you're Presbyterian, something else. Male, one thing. Female, something else. Adolescent, one thing. Senior citizen, something else. Basically, they think that justice has to be meted out differently depending on who you are. And it's different for each person that becomes before the bar of justice. And some way that is going to make us all equal. And they take into account just all kind of things to determine how to apply justice to you. Now, that is absurd on its face. But the thing that a lot of people don't realize when they hear people talk about social justice, these people are not talking about an add-on or addition to the rule of law. These people are talking about a replacement for the rule of law. So don't be confused by nice-sounding phrases like, oh, social justice, oh yeah, who could be against that? Me, I could. Another thing the founders put in place was the whole concept of constitutionally limited government. James Madison wrote, every word of the Constitution decides a question between power and liberty. And they were very attentive to that fact. Progressives. For progressives, the real problem with the Constitution was the failure of the courts to see it as a living organism, one whose limitations on government ought not to be read strictly or literally, but instead to be interpreted to fit the new demands of every age. So you don't have any permanent rights. There's nothing permanent in the law that you can count on. It's going to be interpreted differently. We may decide this week to think about what international law has to say about this. And there's just no fixed standard that you can depend on as you decide whether to go to court or not. It's kind of roll your dice, take your chances. This was clearly not what the founders were trying to achieve. Another concept that a lot of us have forgotten, and I bet none of your children know, because they don't teach this anymore. Harry Truman had this line that was absolutely wrong. Harry Truman said, the buck stops here. Well, that's not exactly right. Under our system of government, the sovereign is you. Now that's different. That marked a demarcation in the history of the world. The buck doesn't stop with the president. The buck stops with you. Because under our form of government, the people, we the people, are sovereign. Gordon Wood is a very prominent historian. He's no conservative. He teaches at Brown. But Gordon is probably one of the 3 or 4 best-known historians in the country today whose field of interest is the founding period. In 2006, he wrote a book called Revolutionary Characters. And in that book, he wrote this. In England, unlike America, the people gave up their full sovereignty to the legislature. In the English Constitution, the nation and the government is considered as one, whereas by ours, the nation and the government are distinct. So if you ever hear a politician say, sure, we're raising taxes in the middle of a recession, but, it's for the government, and the government and the people, well, it's the same thing, really. Well, no, it's not. It's not really the same thing. Gordon Wood also quoted a character from Virginia history. He was a contemporary of Madison and Jefferson, who also just happened to be named John Taylor. John Taylor wrote this. He said, "All our governments are limited agencies of the people, and the electoral process that created them did not eclipse the continued existence of the sovereign people. Under the English system, the people are sovereign on election day, and then for all intents and purposes, the people in England just cease to exist until the next election day." That was never the understanding in this country. But I would be willing to bet none of your kids in school have been taught that in our country, it's the people who are the sovereigns. The form of government. In this country, the founders always spoke of our form of government as being a republic or a democratic republic. Democratic being the less important adjective, republic being the noun. Now, republic is I'll read you Webster's dictionary. Webster defines republic as a state in which the supreme power rests in the citizens, entitled to vote, and the supreme powers rest in all the citizens entitled to vote and is exercised by representatives elected to represent them and be responsible to them. So the power was in the citizens. The government was restricted by the powers granted to it in the Constitution. You had a fixed rule of law that did not change, and people had rights that were not dependent on government. The progressives never talked about republics. They always talked about democracies. Woodrow Wilson wrote this. He said, "Democracy is bound by no principle of its own nature to say no to itself as to the exercise of any power." So once you've got the votes, once you're in office, you're not abridged from doing anything you want. Some of you may have read Walter Williams' columns. Walter Williams is an economics professor at George Mason University. He sometimes takes over for Rush Limbaugh when Rush Limbaugh's on vacations. Walter Williams defines democracy this way. Democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what to have for lunch. That's why the rule of law is important. That's why we don't want pure democracy, because in that scenario, the minority loses and loses big. Purpose of government. Well, the Declaration again made that pretty clear, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Didn't say anything about a Federal Trade Commission or Federal Election Commission or an EPA or whatever. The purpose of government was to protect people's rights, because basically they could do everything else themselves. But it was the government that they established to secure rights.